Hey everyone, we're back again with another Bible study. This is again the Outsiders Bible study that we've been doing the last couple of weeks here at the church via Zoom on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. The one we're doing tonight is about Ruth, who is again, as you can probably guess, is another outsider, and she's who we're going to be talking about, and we're going to talk about how God worked in her life to do His will in the world. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and pray, and we'll get right into the Bible study. Now, we thank you for bringing us once more here today to study your Word and to delve deeply into it, and to hopefully maybe read it in a little bit different light, or a new light than we ever have before, God. And we hope that it benefits our faith life and our daily life, doing your will throughout the world, God. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, here we go. Here is the lesson. Give me 1 second here. All right. So we're going to be talking about Ruth. I know I already said that. And most scholars tend to break Ruth up into 4 distinct scenes. And the 4 scenes are the 4 chapters of Ruth. And it may be good for you to get your Bible out at this moment. So if you want to, feel free to pause and to grab your Bible, because Ruth is short enough of a book that I want to try to get through the entire book in this study, but we don't want to. It's not short enough to where we can read the entire thing. So I'm going to be going through each scene, each chapter, and picking out different verses here and there. Most of them are kind of written on the slides, but not all of them. So it may be helpful for you to have your Bible out. We'll also be going back to Deuteronomy at one point to read a bit about Deuteronomy. So but let's get into it. Ruth. Scene 1 is chapter 1. It's verses 1 through 22. That's the entirety of chapter 1. And we see in chapter 1 that Ruth is she's an outsider in her own culture, right? She's a Moabite woman. So here's I guess we'll set this up just real quickly. Naomi is married to Elimelech. They have 2 sons, and they go to Moab when there is a famine in the land. And from where they live in Israel, and so they go to Moab. I joke about how they're the modern day Okies, right? Because the Okies did back in the Great Depression, and so they go to Moab to find food and land and work and all that kind of stuff. And what happens is while they're there, so it's Naomi and Elimelech, and they have the 2 sons, right? And the 2 sons get married then to Moabite women, and then what happens is I don't think we know why. I don't think, but all 3 of the males in the family die. So both sons and the father, they all die, and the daughters-in-law are they don't have children, and so it's just the 3 of them, the 3 women left. It's Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. Ruth and Orpah are obviously the 2 daughters-in-law. So these 2 women, but particularly Ruth, these 2 daughters-in-law, but particularly Ruth, she's an outsider in her own culture, even, right? She not only, let's just start with this. She marries outside the faith, or outside the nation. She marries outside her own people, which, if there's these poor people come from Israel to a new land, and you marry outside of your people, you marry those people who have come from their land to this new land. What does it say about you? It probably says that you're not much of an insider in your own nation, or otherwise you probably would have married someone or been set up to marry someone who is part of your own nation or culture, right? That's just the way it typically was. And so the fact that she's marrying outside of her people, her own people, it says something about her, that she's probably already an outsider in that place. She disavows the solidarity of her family. She abandons her national identity, and she renounces her religious affiliation. Y'all, do you remember what famous passage from Ruth chapter 1 this is all about right here? Well, it's the whole where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. That's all these things right here. So she's disavowing her own family, right? Your people will be my people. Well, that's the national identity, I guess. Your God will be my God, right? She renounces her religious affiliation in Moab and whoever the Moabite gods were. And she says, no, Naomi, you're an Israelite, but your God will be my God. So she is leaving her entire culture, right? So Naomi tells her, now go back, go to your family. You're young, you can still get married, and Orpah leaves. It seems like she leaves pretty tearfully and weeping, it says, I think the text says. And so she goes back, but Ruth says to Naomi, no, I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to go. And that's when she says, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. All that stuff. That's when she renounces all of these things and goes to this new land. So who does Ruth remind you of? Are there any other stories in the scriptures, any other characters in the scriptures that Ruth reminds you of? Go ahead and pause the video if you'd like to think about it for a second. So the person I'm thinking of is Abraham, right? Abraham leaves his family. He leaves his nation. He even leaves their gods because, a different God speaks to him, the God that we know as God, right? Ends up speaking to Abraham. And so he renounces his old religious affiliations to follow this new God who has spoken to him and called him to go to the new place, the new land. But what are the differences, though, between the Abraham story and the Ruth story? What are the differences? And you can go ahead and pause again if you want to think about those differences for a second. Some of the major differences are that Abraham had a wife, all right? He was a male in that society, which meant that he had more power and status and protection and security and all that kind of stuff. And he also had a call from God. Whereas Ruth kind of stands alone, right? And she doesn't really have any human support or divine support, although it may just seem that she doesn't have divine support, right? She's a young woman who commits herself to an old woman in a world where life depends on men. This is a very outsidery thing to do, a very marginal thing to do. All right, so that's scene one. That's chapter one. We're going to chapter chapter 2 next. There's a verse at the beginning of chapter 2, verse 3. It says, as it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. This phrase, as it happened, here is the phrase in question. If you take the Hebrew translation woodenly, if you kind of just translate each word as it appears, and instead of trying to make it make sense to our English language, if we just translated it woodenly, it would say something along the lines of, well, her happening happened. That sounds stupid to us, sounds kind of strange to us, so we translate it as this, as it happened. Or some people would translate it as by chance. Now, those phrases, as it happened by chance, to us may seem kind of coincidental, but it's actually a code for the presence of the divine. So we just said in the last slide that it seemed like Ruth didn't have any human or divine support like Abraham did, but we see here that she actually does have divine support. This this word by chance, or as it happened, is used in other places in the Old Testament to mean that God grants something. So it doesn't just happen, but that God grants it. God makes it happen. And so this is kind of that's kind of where we are here. So as it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. This is a very Jewish law issue here, where Ruth and Naomi are poor. So Ruth goes to the edge of the fields. We call it the gleaning of the fields, right? There's this law that whenever a landowner harvests, they harvest everything but the edges of the field. And then people who are hungry and needy can come and they can harvest what's left around the edges of the field, so they can have a little bit of something to eat. And so this is the situation here, right? And Boaz sees Ruth and he asks this question. He says, to whom does this young woman belong? Now this question makes sense in Boaz's culture, right? In the Israelite culture, this makes sense. And in most cultures, actually, throughout history, this would make sense that women belong to men when they get married, right? And she's of marrying age, obviously, because in Moab she married Naomi's son before he died. And so, who does this young woman belong to? That makes sense to Boaz to ask that question, but it doesn't really make sense with Ruth's circumstances there. She is, as the slide says, she is remaining in constant tension with the culture that she's in. Not only her own culture back in Moab, which she has left, but now this new Israelite culture that she's now a part of. She's in constant tension with it because not only does she not belong to anybody back in Moab because she has renounced all those people, and she doesn't belong to Naomi because Naomi doesn't really have any real status in their culture, and so she's kind of out there in no man's land. And so the question of who does this woman belong to, it doesn't really make any sense. And because of that, the answer that Boaz's servants give him about who this woman is, they don't follow a typical pattern of how you might answer that question in this time. And instead of saying, well, this is Ruth, the wife of so-and-so, or Ruth, the daughter of so-and-so, they say this: she is the Moabite who came back with Naomi. She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi. No mention of men, no mention of fathers, no mention of anything. But they call her a Moabite, which is what she is. Not an Israelite. It's distinct right there. She's not an Israelite. This is the Moabite who came back with Naomi. And presumably they all know Naomi's story. So this answer, as one scholar puts it, derives her being Ruth, derives Ruth's identity from her strangeness. And also from another woman, which is also itself just simply strange. And so what Boaz does is he goes up to Ruth and he says, all right, Ruth, make sure you stay in my field, right? So there is, what it seems like is that there was a huge field, and it was kind of divided into portions for who owned which ones, and there was no kind of fences, I suppose, in this time, right? And so she happens to come upon the part of the field that Boaz owns, and Boaz tells her, don't go to anybody else's field, stay in my field. I'll make sure that my servants and the other women who are working for me and who are also gleaning these edges of the fields, that they take care of you, that you're not harassed or endangered or anything like that. So just stay in my field, and I'll make sure that you are protected and taken care of, and that you get what you need to survive, right? That's what he says to her at one point. Excuse me. And then this is her response to Boaz's kindness. She says this: why have I found favor in your sight when I am a foreigner? Why have I found favor in your sight when I'm a foreigner? Now this image over here on the right of your screen literally is the image of that little scene there. It says down here, it's in the King James. It's a little bit shadowy, but I'll try to read it. It says this: she bowed herself and said to him, why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou would take knowledge of me, right? Found favor in your sight, a grace in your sight, that thou would take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger, a foreigner, a stranger, right? It's the same idea here. Why have I found grace? Why have I found favor in your sight? And that's the question, right? Why has she found favor in his sight? So Boaz recognizes Ruth's distinctiveness. At least that's how he responds. He says this: you have left your father and your mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know. You left your father and your mother and your native land, and you came to a people and a place that you did not know. So, again, who does this remind you of? And I think the answer is squarely that it's Abraham from Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Leave your father and your mother and your native land and go to a place that I will show you. And so he blesses her. And he grants her safety as if under God's wings. And the word I put in parentheses there is cloak. He blesses her and grants her safety as if under God's own wings. Now, the fact that he says this to her, right? He blesses her and he says, essentially recounts the Abraham story in her story. It's a recognition that locates her directly in the saga of Israel. She is not an Israelite, but he, by saying these things, by blessing her as if under God's own wings, and recounting her story in very similar comparison to the Abraham story, locates her squarely in the Israelite story, even though she's not an Israelite. Right? All right. Moving on then to chapter 3, scene 3. This is the entirety of chapter 3. This is what we call the story of the scene at the threshing floor. And I'll just set this brief scene up for you real quick. At the end of the harvest, there was a celebration, and typically alcoholic beverages were involved and that kind of thing. Maybe some similar to our Thanksgiving, perhaps. I don't really know. But there was a festival, a celebration. And so Boaz goes and sleeps on the threshing floor that night. And Naomi tells Ruth to go find Boaz. And it's actually about midnight, the text says. And so she goes and finds Boaz, and he's on the threshing floor. And she wakes him up in a peculiar way. And then he says this to her: "Who are you? Who are you?" Now, perhaps it could be a little delirious. Perhaps it could be a little bit still asleep, maybe, right? But the fact that he's woken up and is woken up and is asking a woman, "Who are you?" is a very interesting question, right? Because if you compare this to what he asked in chapter 1, or is that chapter 2? One of those two. I think it's chapter 2, actually. From chapter 2, he asks, who does this woman belong to? But here he's asking, well, who are you? So he's already giving her a little bit of her own identity. He's giving her a little bit of her own authority, if you will. So the first time he asked, who do you belong to, or who does she belong to? And now he's asking her, who are you? And she replies with her name, right? I'm Ruth. And she says this: "Spread your cloak." Same word from the previous chapter where it's translated as God's wing, right? Or the wing of God, right? There's just that word wing. "Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are my next of kin." So this she's directly kind of quoting his blessing from the chapter before. We don't really know how long amount of time passed between these. I don't think between her starting to glean in the fields and the harvest celebration when this happens. But what she's doing is she's challenging him to heed his earlier prayer for her blessing. One scholar says that this foreign woman calls an Israelite man to responsibility. So he, in the previous chapter, the previous scene, he blesses her and says, "May God's wing be over you." And so she says, well, spread your cloak over me then, right? She's calling him to do what he has asked God to do, which is kind of an amazing thing, right? That she's kind of putting him to task here and telling him what he needs to do, which is what he calls on God to do just the chapter before. It's super, super interesting. And so then it seems like Boaz takes the bait, right? He's like, "You're probably right. I probably should do this," right? But in verse 12 and following, he spells out to Ruth that he's actually not the next of kin. Someone else, excuse me, someone else is the next of kin, and that person has to take responsibility legally for Ruth, unless he forgoes his responsibility. And then after that person, then Boaz would actually be the next of kin, right? So in the line, Boaz is the second in line there. There's someone else above him who is supposed to take responsibility for the next of kin. So, according to their custom, the actual next of kin must take responsibility for Ruth. This is what we call, excuse me, this is what we call the levirate marriage. I don't think this comes up in the rest of this slide. So we're going to talk about it right now. We're talking about levirate marriage. And this idea of levirate marriage is that a woman who is once married and doesn't have any kids must attempt to have children with that husband's next living male kin to continue on the line of the deceased family member, right? So I'm going to try. It sounds crazy to our minds. This is actually something that's found in more clan and tribal societies throughout the world and throughout history. It sounds weird to our minds, but this is something that's not really unheard of at all. So again, it's so you have a man and a woman, and who are married, and if they don't have any children and the husband dies, then that person's next of kin has to try to have children with the widow so that the deceased husband's lineage will continue. Does that make sense? I know it's wild, but we're actually going to read all about it right now. So flip over to Deuteronomy 25. Deuteronomy 25, starting in verse 10. Verse 5, verses 5 through 10. It says this: when brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her, and the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. But if the man has no desire to marry his brother's widow, then the brother's widow shall go up to the elders at the gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of this town shall summon him and speak to him. If he persists, saying, I have no desire to marry her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull off his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and declare, this is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And throughout Israel, his family shall be known as the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. The two things to keep in mind as we go to the next scene. First of all, this is all done at the gate of the city. And second of all, that crazy seed where if the person who doesn't want to fulfill his duty as the next of kin for the levirate marriage, that person, the widow, gets to take off that person's sandal, rip it off, spit in his face, and yell at him. So remember all that, okay, as we get into the next scene. There's a little bit more in this scene. So what Boaz says is that if this person, this actual next of kin, doesn't want to fulfill his role as the next of kin in the levirate marriage, then if that person doesn't, then Boaz will do it. And so, sorry, I know I just went through all this, but this is the levirate marriage thing, right? This is the entire thing that we just read about in Deuteronomy. Who else have we talked about so far about levirate marriage with? This is thinking back a couple of weeks from prior to this. Who else have we talked about with levirate marriage? And you can feel free to pause this if you want and think about it, or even go do a little bit of research if you want to and figure it out. All right, so this is actually Tamar. From the very first week we talked about Tamar being in Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus, from Genesis chapter 38. I highly suggest you go back and read that story if you haven't yet. It is extremely intriguing, interesting, and a little bit scandalous, which is kind of great. But she is involved in a levirate marriage issue as well, just as Ruth seems to be here. All right. So chapter 4, scene 4, Boaz goes to the gates of the city that next day, and he happens to find the next of kin, just happens to be there, right? Perhaps by chance. I don't know if the text says that, but perhaps it's just by chance that the next of kin is there. And he puts forth the situation to the next of kin. He says, listen, Elimelech has this land and you're the next of kin. Elimelech, it was Naomi's husband, right? There's this land, and you're the next of kin, so you really should buy it from Naomi. And he says, yeah, sure, that's great. I'll buy it. He says, I'll perform my duty as the next of kin. I'll buy that land, because he's thinking I get, fairly cheap land, more land, make myself some more money and that kind of stuff, grow my portfolio, if you will. But then Boaz says that if he buys this parcel of land that belonged to Elimelech, so if he buys it from Naomi, he has to also take Ruth as his wife. And so when that piece of the information comes to him, he's a little bit more hesitant to do so. And he says, yeah, I don't really need that land that much. I don't want to do that. I don't want to take Ruth as my wife. I don't really need that land. You can have it. So by refusing to do this, by refusing to perform his role as the next of kin, he by refusing to do that, he then gives up his position as next of kin, as well as the one who must perform the levirate marriage duty. And so both of those things have now been passed on to Boaz. And Boaz takes her as his wife, and they have a child and that kind of thing. One thing we did not talk about from chapter 1 is whenever Naomi and Ruth come back to Bethlehem, which is where they are. When they come back to Bethlehem, there are some women walking around Bethlehem, and they say, surely this is not Naomi, is it? And they say it in kind of a way that's a little more sarcastic. They're kind of scoffing at her. They're judging her even, right? Maybe not in a bad way, but they definitely know what hardship she's come across or has come across her while they've been in Moab, and the fact that she's now come back here with a Moabite daughter-in-law. They're kind of talking about how this surely this can't be Naomi, can it? But so that's in chapter 1. Now we're in chapter 4, at the end of the entire story, and these same women. It says the witnesses, but it's the same women. They make this statement: "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel." Actually, I take that back. I think that quote is actually from the elders and the witnesses there in the marketplace when Boaz takes on the role of next of kin. But it's this idea, though, that before they scoffed at Naomi, before Naomi had no identity, Ruth had no identity. They scoffed at Ruth and Naomi. Again, Ruth had no identity. They said, "Who does this woman belong to?" And they say it's a Moabite woman who came back with Naomi, or whatever. But now Ruth is being praised and made to be like two of the matriarchs, right? May this person be like Rachel and Leah, who are two matriarchs who built up the house of Israel. So they're putting her up on this pedestal now, which is kind of amazing. And then now we get to this part about the woman. I don't know. I'm sorry. I jumped ahead. I got a little excited. But now that we have these women who scoffed at Naomi from chapter 1 saying, "Is this Naomi?" Right now they've changed their tune. Right now this is what they say: "For your daughter-in-law who loves you," that's Ruth, right? "For your daughter-in-law who loves you is more than 7 sons." It's more than 7 sons. So Ruth, the outsider of the story, leaves the story exalted above the ideal number of male children and identified through the woman who she swore allegiance to, even beyond death. So Ruth has made this amazing transformation, right? From a Moabite woman who was probably an outsider already in her own culture, her own nation, to now being compared to two of the matriarchs in Israelite history, as well as saying that she's even greater than having 7 sons. And having sons is ideal. Having 7 sons is like the most ideal form of family, which is crazy. And now she's made this entire transition to being revered and exalted, even though she's an outsider. Now, we know that she also is from Jesus' genealogy, that she also extends the line of Abraham all the way to Jesus. She's actually, I believe it's David's great grandmother. That's kind of cool to think about. I never thought about Ruth that way, really, about how David probably knew Ruth, right? I mean, I knew my own grandmother, a couple of them actually, I think, at least one of them, and David probably knew Ruth and knew Boaz. I mean, that's wild to think about in a unique way. I did skip over. That's really all I have. I do have one just interesting bit of information that I skipped over. Remember how I said that read that whole part from Deuteronomy about the taking off of the sandal and that kind of thing. When Ruth's actual next of kin is at the city gate with Boaz, and he gives up his right to the next of kinship status, he actually takes off his own sandal, which is just an interesting thought. Interesting piece of information there. So again, that's all I got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that our time together was prayerful and interesting and beneficial to your faith and your knowledge of the Bible. Hope to see you guys back soon right here. And I think we're actually going to talk about David next time. And I know that David might not seem like an outsider to you, but in many ways he kind of was. So just think of that, remember that, and we'll see you guys next time. All right, praise be to God.